have watched hundreds of people die. And in sitting at the bedside of the dying, I have noticed a common theme. We are not dying well. People of color, Black people especially, are not dying well. In my role as a hospice clinician, I provide emotional support and supportive socialization to those who are dying. The patients I work with have been diagnosed with a terminal illness and are projected to live 6 months or less. There was one particular patient on my caseload who I will call Diana. I have removed her face, changed her name, and some of the details for HIPAA purposes. But Diana is a woman I will never forget. Every time I would go and call Diana to offer her support, she would say, "Oh no, baby, I'm not feeling well. Call again later." And I would always ask, "Well, if you aren't feeling well, can I send a nurse to your home?" And she would say, "Oh no, baby, I'm dealing with the pain." Now, I'm used to my hospice patients being reluctant to speak to me. After all, very few of us want to talk about our life, let alone the end of it. But eventually, my nurse was able to go out and meet with Diana. And upon meeting her, she noticed that most of her problems were emotional. She was extremely stressed out. She suffered from anxiety and depression, but refused to see me. She was sick, but she wasn't tired of being sick yet. One of the times I called her, and her husband actually answered the phone. He invited me over the next day. Now, I was a little nervous after all of my phone calls and having been told over and over to just keep calling back. But he insisted I come. He practically pleaded with me. "She needs to see you." So I agreed, and I arrived at her home the next day. And I remember when I approached her door and rang the bell, a frail, elderly Black woman appeared. She had a cane in one hand and struggled to keep her oxygen cord out of the way with the other hand. This was my first time meeting her. But I have seen this woman more times than I care to count. When working with the dying, I have noticed what is necessary and unnecessary when it comes to suffering. We often push off self-care until it's too late. Black people are dying younger and at disproportionate rates due in part to heart attacks, high blood pressure, and cardiac concerns as a result of our unprocessed trauma. Unprocessed trauma that becomes stored in our bodies, manifesting itself through somatic symptoms. That is killing us sooner than should be expected. African Americans are more likely to die early from all causes, at all ages, as we can see here in this diagram. High blood pressure, diabetes, strokes, all across the board. Black women are almost 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. And all across the board, Black people are less likely to receive a kidney transplant and more likely to die from breast, prostate, and stomach cancer, while being more likely to develop Alzheimer's and have a stroke. There are large gaps in the health between Blacks and whites. The difference in that can often be attributed to how the medical establishment treats people of color. In fact, every 7 minutes a Black person in the United States dies prematurely. That's more than 200 people a day who wouldn't die if the health rates between Blacks and whites were equal. Now, I highlight the United States because that's where I'm from, but we even see this on a global scale in places here, like Canada, where there's universal health care, to places like South Africa, and even the UK. Imagine for a moment, if you will, a fully loaded airplane with 200 Black passengers and crew. taking off from the airport. I want you to visualize it. And then that airplane crashes today. And another airplane with 200 more black passengers and crew loads again, takes off from the airport, and crashes again tomorrow. And every day next month for the entire year, because this is the reality in dying black. We would probably do more if it was actually an airplane. And one of the first things that we hear when we actually board an airplane from the flight attendants in an event of an emergency is to put our mask on first. We have to. And too many of us are operating mask off, and unfortunately, it is killing us sooner than should be expected. Consider the impact of therapy when going through traumatic experiences. I'm on a mission to change the narrative on self-care through the use of therapy so we can all live and die well. Because therapy has a unique way of healing us from our traumas. My patient who I told you about earlier, Diana, who would often greet me with, "Oh no, baby, I'm not feeling well." After a few visits, she would never again greet me with this. We would go through some progressive muscle relaxation, tapping, and after a few visits, she actually said she could breathe again. Now, this is a woman who was on hospice, projected to die. She had end-stage COPD and was on 3 liters of oxygen. And after just working with me for a couple of weeks, she told me she could breathe again. And eventually, my medical team actually decided to discharge her from hospice because we no longer saw any signs of decline. Yes, sometimes we do discharge people from hospice alive. But unfortunately, it doesn't always end so well. So you can imagine when I met my patient Ruby, I have also removed her face and changed some of the details for HIPAA purposes. She lived in the very same apartment complex that my Uncle Wayne lived in before he died. My Uncle Wayne was a military veteran. He suffered from PTSD and used alcohol to cope, like so many others I know. Thanksgiving 2004 would be his last drink. A few days later, he took his last breath. I often think about Ruby and my uncle and how they both had eerie similarities. They were both young, black, both had cirrhosis of the liver, and both suffered from PTSD. They also both used alcohol as a coping mechanism. I wish I could have met Ruby 10 years ago and told her that she could go to therapy. I wish I could have put a name to my uncle's pain and told him that he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and that there were other things that he could do, that he did not have to drink to heal from his pain, that he could go to therapy. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have lost someone you love, but this is all too common for people of color. Ruby and Diana represent just 2 of hundreds of individuals who are on my caseload. I share some of their stories so that every one of in this room and every one of us who are listening can make a change and do better. And that may look like going to therapy. Now, there are a number of things that we can do to heal and prolong our life. But as a licensed mental health therapist, I'm going to focus on therapy and how that can actually benefit and improve our lives. The health deficits for Blacks in America can literally be traced back to American chattel slavery. Jim Crow to present day, where Black lives don't matter, so we need a hashtag to prove that it does. We can't even eat ice cream in our own living rooms. Rest in peace to Botham Jean. We can't even play video games without being killed. Rest in peace to Tatiana Jefferson. When I think about all of the lives that are lost, I reflect back on my own family. On Monday, it will be the anniversary of my Aunt Lynn, who was just 52 when she died. She was poor and Black, and the medical system treated her that way, and she died unnecessarily. I also think about my Uncle Kenny, who was just 54 when he died alone, traveling to another state in search of work and health insurance in an attempt to prevent the inevitable. I was probably one of the last people he texted before he took his last breath. My cousin, Aaron Montgomery, was just 34 when he died from heart-related complications. And the world mourned the loss of Ermias Nipsey Hussle, who was slain in the same way so many Black boys who look like him have died before. His perpetrator was actually found checking himself into a psychiatric facility before he was caught by the police. Imagine the life that could be saved if he had the tools necessary to heal from his rage, as opposed to being pointed through the barrel of a gun. Therapy saves lives. And unfortunately, too many people of color are dying from chronic stress-related illnesses, just like that of American film director John Singleton, who was just 52 when he died from a stroke. The same thing that killed my grandmother at 62. The leading cause for strokes is high blood pressure. High blood pressure is related to stress. See the correlation? Now, I mentioned Nipsey Hussle, and the last time the world actually seen a celebrity-related killing was in the late 90s with Tupac Amaru Shakur and Christopher Wallace. But this is an ongoing reality in dying Black. Childhood trauma is especially insidious. Through adverse childhood experiences, or what we call ACEs, we can now measure the impact of childhood toxic stress, just like that of cholesterol. You get 1 point for each type of trauma. The higher your ACE score, the higher your risk for health and social problems. Did you grow up in a household with physical or emotional abuse? Even sexual? Were one of your parents incarcerated, or even someone in your household? Were your parents divorced? Did someone in your home suffer from a mental illness? If so, you get 1 point. The higher your ACE score, the higher your risk of having a lower mortality. As we can see here, adverse childhood experiences disrupt neurodevelopment, and Blacks all across the globe tend to have higher ACE scores, resulting in dying younger. I help those up until their last breath. We can all do something to improve our life and live longer, because the reality is we're all eventually going to die. But we shouldn't be dying at 30 years old, 34 like my cousin, 52 or 54 like my aunt and uncle. There are things that we can do to lower our risk for chronic stress-related illnesses. And there are culturally responsive therapists such as myself. Every day I transform and even decolonize the way we do therapy so that we can all live well and eventually die well. Thank you.